Hello, everyone, and also hello to everyone joining us through Zoom. It's my pleasure today to welcome Michael Lankes, who will give a talk on the power of social gaze in games. Michael is a professor for game art design and interaction design at the media design department at the University of Applied Sciences in Upper Austria. And he is also research director of the Playful Interactive Environments group, in short PI. And Michael has built up a reputation, international reputation on social gaze and gaze-based interactions in games, and it's my pleasure to have you here today, and I will immediately give the floor to you. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. It's a great honor for me to be invited to the JKU. It's also very nice for me to talk about the topic that is very relevant for me, that characterized my research in the last years. And before I will go into the details, Günther already mentioned some things about me. As Günther mentioned, my name is Michael, and as you can see, I'm quite interested in games in general. To be more specific, I am a lecturer and a researcher at the campus Hagenberg, so 25 kilometers from here approximately. And here my main interests are, so these are the subjects that I teach are game art, level design, also narrative stuff like story development, and also a little bit of interaction design and HCI. So these are some intersections that Günther and I had, and we collaborated in several projects. So the combination of art stuff and technologies was always a thing that fascinated me. And just to get you an impression what our students do at our institution. So this is a VR games project that our master students did under my supervision. It's some mean people would say it's a walking simulator. I would say it's an explorative exploration game. And you can see it's a VR experience that deals with the serious topic of child abuse. So we use these kind of games as a vehicle to transport relevant and serious subjects. So it's not just about entertaining, but it's also a vehicle to convey something relevant. And in this case, you can try it also out by yourself. You can be downloaded on Steam, and it's for free. And so these are the typical projects that I supervise. So as you can see, these things relate more on the production of games. So there is not there's no big research agenda behind it. This is the other part of me, so to say. As Günther mentioned, I'm also head of the Playful Interactive Environments research group, and we have several different topics that we are interested in. And just to give you these other, so to say, main three topics that relate to games. It's a combination. Actually, the research group is composed of different members. So we have people from sound design. We also have animators. And there are also people like me who are interested in games. And specifically, we have here three fields of activities. First are the so-called playful natural user interfaces, where also gaze interaction belongs. But we also have other things like gesture interaction or also embodied interaction in general. Apart from that, we also are interested in virtual and augmented reality game spaces. So we have a very long and intense cooperation with the Ars Electronica Center, with the Deep Space. So mostly every year we develop a game for them, which is then exhibited at the Ars Electronica Festival. And we also do research. We have several research projects that deal with games for impact, which is a fancy word for serious games. It's not that serious, but in general, we are here interested in so-called persuasive games, so to promote or facilitate certain behaviors like quit smoking and some other stuff. But in general, these are these three topics that we are interested in. Concerning the topic itself, so it's called the power of social gaze. The research activity in this field can be attributed to the first part, so this kind of natural, playful natural user interfaces. And I started this thing actually I was quite shocked when I looked at the publication dates, 2012, so 10 years ago. I started doing research in this field with a focus on interaction. So it has to be clearly stated that gaze or eye tracking in general serves in this case two purposes. First, it's the analysis part, so people or researchers can analyze the gaze behavior of such subjects. And the other thing is the interaction part. So where can we use gaze as means to interact with the game, which could be something, an augmentation of the interaction with the game, or even a substitution of a mouse or keyboard and so forth. And just to give you an idea how things looked at the time, so this was or is a video by Tobii. Tobii is one of the big companies still today who earn their money with eye tracking in general, so mainly with gaze analysis, but also they developed games. In this case, this was some kind of a use case or a demo to show the crowd how gaze could be used in the game. So it's quite straightforward. We have to save Earth and look at asteroids to make them explode. So a little bit of a power fantasy, I might guess. Yeah, so these were the beginnings, and they created this kind of tech demos. And the technology itself, it was quite bulky, and the gaze interaction itself mainly focused on desktop settings. So no VR whatsoever. And this was also my first contact with this piece of technology. This is the Tobii Rex, and with it you could simply play games with your eyes. But things have changed. So we are now in 2022. And several things were done here. So first, Tobii tried to get into the main market. AAA games are now featuring gaze-based interactions. So you can see this is a AAA game, Assassin's Creed. And you can see here the features that gaze allows. For instance, aim at gaze, you can look at enemies and then you can target them. Or you have a so-called extended view. So based on your gaze behavior, the camera position changes slightly. You can see this is the gaze position, and with this kind of extended view, you can reorientate the camera a little bit. And there are also some very nice gimmick features that are built on top of the game, so you do not have to have an eye tracker to play the game. It's something that is optional, and in some cases, I also might say it's like a little bit of a gadget. So it's not that feasible in some situations. And there are many different other ways how gaze could be integrated. Or you can see these are more like cosmetic effects. For instance, when you look outside, the interior scene gets darker and so forth. So it's these like of little changes that should increase the immersion within the game. And they have quite a huge portfolio now, since this kind of very strong cooperation with Ubisoft. And so this is the one field of application, or where you can see AAA games. On the other hand, there are also games, so-called indie games, which do not typically have a big budget, and they try to go into different ways with gaze interaction. In this case, the game is called Before Your Eyes from 2021. And within this game, you re-experience certain situations of a person's life. And these are different sequences, and the sequences stop when you close your eyes. So you are encouraged to keep your eyes as long as open as possible to get as much out of the plot. And when you blink, another situation appears. So it's like a more of a playful way, more of an integrative way of using gaze in games. By the way, this game doesn't require an eye tracker. It uses a simple webcam. So this is also one thing that maybe we can discuss later on about the availability of this kind of eye tracking devices. And of course, technology also evolved. You can see here on the left upper corner, this is the latest generation of the eye tracker from Tobii, much smaller, much more powerful, and much more robust. And also you can see here that these kind of eye trackers were integrated in different technologies like VR, augmented reality, or even mobile technologies. I would even go so far and to say that the future technologies like VR or so, eye tracking will become a standard because of technological reasons, which I will elaborate at the end of the lecture. So this is the broad picture. So 10 years of gaze interaction in games. It started quite simple and things evolved quite quickly. So the 10 years have passed, and during this period, I did lots of gaze research in different directions. So for instance, I did gaze-based player guidance, so where I used gaze to guide the player to a certain area in a level, or we used gaze in competitive and collaborative games where people play together, which will be described in the next upcoming minutes. And also some other stuff that are more tool related, like gaze-based aim assistance. So when you look at stuff, you have some kind of a bullet magnetism. So when you shoot, the bullet goes into the direction where you're actually currently looking. So different kind of stuff here. And to give you a more better understanding how these things relate to each other, I showed you the first example of this kind of eye asteroids game, which is quite a simple thing. So you use gaze as a mechanic. You look at something and this thing explodes. And to provide an overview on the different ways gaze can be used, I restructured an existing categorization by Michael Nietzsche, who wrote a very interesting book about video game spaces, and applied this categorization on gaze interaction. So as I first said, so this kind of eye asteroids game, it uses mechanics, or it combines gaze with mechanics, and this would be the so-called rule-based space. So you're doing here game design. You establishing mechanics, you're describing rules, and this defines how the game works. This thing is quite abstract, so you have to code this stuff, and this typically cannot be conveyed to a player. So you have to have some kind of a mediated space, which would be the left aspect in the right corner. The mediated space all entails things like game art, game sound, and in this case, you could then see or research gaze in the context of game art and level design, all these kind of things that mediate the mechanics. And games, as the name implies, a game is an artifact, and in order to provide something meaningful, you have to have a player. So game also implies play, and this would be then the other things that are related to this kind of space, to the spaces. So first you have the fictional space. The player plays a game, and in his mind, meaning emerges, and he experiences something. And this could be categorized, I'm aware it's quite general, so gaze in the context of game experience. So these kind of interactions arouse a certain experience within the player's mind. And on the other hand, we have the fourth part, gaze in the context of play. So these are the things that can be observed by pressing a button, looking somewhere. So gaze interaction here is meant in the context of play. And last but not least, which is actually the main relevant topic. So sorry that I'm had this kind of very, I hope it's not too tedious to have this kind of introduction, but I think it makes sense to have this kind of view on the subject. So gaze in the context of social play. What does this mean? So gaze in games in general, I think we all agree plays a relevant part, or plays a relevant role. Like in card games, where people play against each other, simply by looking at the gaze behavior of your opponent, you can, for instance, estimate if someone is nervous or he thinks about a certain tactic. So these, or you have some kind of a poker face, you try to mislead or even hide your intentions, for instance, in this kind of competitive games. This is a thing that is seldomly used in digital games, and this was the reason why we thought that this could make sense. This could be an interesting area of research. And in order to get a better understanding of the things that we did, I want simply just to show you some projects that we carried out over the last years. And the first thing that I want to show you is social gaze, so the inclusion of kind of social communication in competitive games. So what do I mean by that? This is a publication, it's quite old actually, 2016, that we presented with some colleagues. And the basic notion here is that we wanted to have some kind of an experience like in these spaghetti westerns, where we have this kind of duel between these opponents, and it's like this Mexican shootout. So where you want to, or where you are interested in seeing who draws first the gun, and gaze plays here a vital role. And in this case, we wanted to research scenarios where gaze is not just a simple add-on to the game experience, but it's a crucial element in the social interaction, a thing that fosters social bonding between the opposing players. And very, very relevant in this context here was remote settings. So settings where people are not interacting in a co-located situation, but you have this kind of remote setting where certain interaction channels are simply not present. So you cannot see, for instance, the facial expressions in detail or the gaze behavior in detail. And what we did was actually quite simple from a technological point of view. We had two different rooms, two people that played against each other, and what they could do, so they have a remote connection, they played a remote competitive game against each other, and what they saw was the gaze behavior of the opponent. So player one could see where player two is currently looking, and player two could see where player one's gaze position was at a given moment. So it wasn't, so to say, always on approach. You can always see where your opponent was looking. And we had, so to say, it was important for us to have a kind of a diverse view on the subject. So games are quite different, and so genres entail different mechanics, and these mechanics might have an impact on the way we see the opponent. And in this case, we made this we defined these two settings. First, we had online competitive games that require motoric skills, like these real-time strategy games, where time and also motoric skills play a vital role. So it's not sufficient to have superb strategies when you cannot carry out these strategies in a predefined time period. So this was the first genre. And the other genre was this kind of turn-based games. So where strategic skills are mainly required and quick reactions do not play a relevant role. Although these kind of games also have some kind of timers behind it, because it would then have a negative impact on the game flow in general. So things like card games, board games, and so forth. These two genres we investigated. And you can see here these two games that we used. So the first thing, I think it's quite popular. I do not have to explain this game in detail. It's Mills or Nine Men's Morris or Dame in German. And it's a turn-based game. So we have two players. We have a predefined number of game pieces. And you have, the movement is restricted based on the game board. Turn-based game, no time pressure. Two people play against each other. The other game that we used, I think it's not that well known, just to give you an idea what this game is. It's called Screen Sheets, and it's a co-located game. So people setting in the same room can also play it remotely, of course. But the main, the interesting design decision is that every player is invisible. So you cannot see the other player. And you have to screen sheet, that's the reason why it's called screen sheet, to derive the approximate position of the player. So you have to cheat actually to be successful. And this game was especially relevant, of course, to us, since gaze behavior plays here a vital role. So we can clearly see if someone is screen cheating or not. And so I won't go into the details. If you're interested, I can send you the paper. In general, what we found out was that the kind of gaze, the usefulness of gaze is heavily dependent on the genre itself. So in turn-based games where time pressure is not of importance, gaze was actually used quite often as a way to mislead players. So for instance, they looked at certain areas on the game board to make the other player aware that they might choose this kind of area here to play the game. But on the other hand, the other games where these kind of twitch skills were required, this was quite of a different story. So people, it's a very fast game where the visual information is quite heavy, and these kind of very subtle information. So we also thought that the gaze representation itself maybe was too small. We had to, for instance, make it more prominent. But in general, that we got the feedback that that in many cases the gaze in these kind of Twitch-based games doesn't play a significant role. So other things are more crucial when you play the game. So you have to react on the other player, and this kind of additional information was simply blended out after some time. On the other hand, this board game, we identified some kind of a meta play. So people used gaze as an additional layer of play where they, so to say, mislead the other person. We were also not interested in competitive games, but also in collaborative games as well. And this is a paper from 2018. And in this case, we addressed the issue that we, in the previous project, we had this continuous display of gaze. And some people reported that through the continuous display of gaze, the meaning of certain gaze situations was not clear to them. So we thought maybe we should be more explicitly, or in other words, to have some kind of an event-based gaze feedback. So what does this mean? Gaze has certain functions and certain meanings in human-human communication. For instance, gaze could be used as a desire to show a desire for interaction. So when I look at someone, I signal the counterpart that I'm interested in interacting with that person. Another thing would be signs of intent. So if you're intending, if you want to communicate something very explicitly, you can use gaze as well, for instance, during a dinner. And another thing is joint attention. So when you're interested in the same subject, people tend to attend to the same object. And this could be also a way to, or you can see where gaze has a communicative function between people. And we try to replicate this kind of different meanings of gaze in a game prototype. You can see here, so this is the eye tracker that is mounted below the monitor. And we had a very simple Lego construction game where two players were asked to create different things, house and pet and so forth. And we used gaze, or the implemented gaze, in different ways. So we had different conditions. We did an experiment here. So the first condition that we had was the always-on approach. So this was the approach that we used also in our previous experiments, where you could continuously see the gaze position of your collaborator. So this kind of orange outline shows you the object that the player currently looks at. In the second condition, we have different variations. So we had, for instance, the joint attention visualizer, and you can see here this effect. So when only one person or a player looks at an object, you have a rather thin outline with a color code that is related to the player. When two people look at the same object, the outline becomes thicker and changes color. This was one feature. Another feature was the so-called gaze pointer. So by pressing a button, you could then use this kind of HUD to communicate that something might be of an importance, so you could direct the player. Another thing that we integrated, and this was actually a thing that many people enjoyed, was this kind of real-time mapping of the gaze position. So you can see here this kind of white dots of the simple character replicate the actual gaze behavior of the other player. And what we also did is, you could see it here, we had this kind of vignetting effect. So the areas in the corners become a little bit darker, and this should communicate that someone is watching me or is looking at me. So this might be an indicator for making some, if a player wants to make the other player aware of a certain situation. And the third condition was the no gaze condition. So this was, so to say, the integration just to make sure if gaze in general had an impact on the players themselves. And I think that I completely forgot to mention this, we focused here mainly on social presence. So we were interested if this kind of gaze integration fosters the feeling of if there is someone there, and just increase the closeness between the collaborators. And you can see the people are quite creative. So these are screenshots from the things that people created. And yeah, we replicated basically the findings. So the first condition, people noticed the gaze behavior for a certain amount of time, but after some time they tend to neglect it since it doesn't have any communicative function. While in the other, this kind of other condition where we had this kind of event-based approach, where gaze was used as a way to, for instance, communicate joint attention or signals desire of interest, desire for interaction, this was quite positive. So it's a good idea to have these kind of communicative functions embedded in gaze. Another thing that we did, so many different projects here, was to the games that we previously researched were have this kind of symmetric constellation. So each player had the same opportunities or possibilities to interact with the game. We continued our study by having focused more on asymmetric settings. So where we have a player, and in this case, spectators, so active roles and more passive roles. And this was done in 2017. And just to give an impression how gaze could be used as a communicator, as a bonding element between an audience and a player. So Toby developed a service called Toby Ghost. And what you can see here, YouTube players could share their gaze position to the audience. So the YouTube player himself doesn't see his gaze position, but the audience could see where the YouTube is currently looking at. Afterwards, of course, you can analyze your gameplay. So afterwards, so it doesn't impact your gameplay, but it's a rather simplistic one. So you have many viewers and one subject, and this approach also uses the always on approach. So the gaze is constantly shown without any way of including these kind of social relevant situations. And our approach was, how could we integrate the audience more, or how could we make the player more aware of the audience? And the reason why we are doing this was simply by building on the notion that if you are being watched, especially when you're a rookie or a newbie, your performance increases when you're being watched. And we thought this could be interesting. And we used this kind of Toby Ghost approach, but here we had a so-called event-based approach. So gaze was not always shown, but only in significant situations. So for instance, this was a situation where the gaze position was shown when the player and the audience looked at the same subject. When this was not the case, gaze was not shown. And there were some other things that we experimented with. So as shown in the previous study, it makes sense to think about the communicative function of gaze. And this was actually quite a weird idea for me. I was hiking or so, and I thought this would be an interesting way of doing stuff. It's using the concept of social gaze in so-called minimalist games. And what are minimalist games? You can see these things. These are the things in the background. So things that are rather abstract. So where I thought it might be interesting to use this kind of concepts of social gaze and map it to something abstract. And you can see it here. This was one of the few experiments that I did. So you are actually playing one simple dot, and I hope you could see also the other thing here that jumps around. This is the actual gaze position of the player. So there's also a very thin line. I'm not sure if you can see it. So that communicates, okay, there's a relation between these two things. So this is the representation. You control the player with the cursor keys, very simple. And you also have your gaze position. And the elements in this kind of very simple universe react to you based on your way you move, and also if you look at them. And they made some different experiments. So these are more the shy triangles. So when I look at them, they tend to evade. And here the goal is to not look at them to get some point bubbles. And simply this was a way of showing the communicative function of gaze when there's some kind of an intent and there's a reaction by some other elements. So also very abstract thing. And what's that? That is also, yeah, this is also a way of showing, so to say, interest in something. So the more often that you look at an element, the stronger the relation between you and this element gets. So when you look at these things, then they emit bubbles, and then can you pick them up? And yeah, after some time, they build a relation. So they try to follow you, and after some time, you have a huge network simply based on your gaze behavior. Yeah, and this was also a thing that's called joint interest. So in this case, you want to get to these kind of bubbles that are inside these huge bubbles. And how do you do that? You simply have to look at these kind of bubbles, and there are some other actors in the scene that help you to yeah, get these bubbles. So the idea was here to transport these very complex human behavior into a abstract minimalist game. And I did some other experiments here. This is one part, it was part of Kai 2020, a demo. And what we were interested here is to show this kind of experience where someone wants to obtain information of a visual rich scene, and he or she doesn't get this information. So we used here gaze to obstruct things, and this was a prototype that we also want to integrate in social settings where we have this kind of asymmetry, which I described previously. So in this case, this was a first concept, the first prototype, where you are walking through a small forest, and yeah, it's a very nice scene, and you want to look at the stuff, but unfortunately, everything is occluded. When you look at something, it becomes white, and the longer you look at something, the bigger, or the more the information is obstructed. Yeah, so this was a rough overview of the things that I did in social gaze. Some things where I'm interested in the future, some future projects. So of course, technology is still evolving. So we have now devices, VR and also XR devices with a high resolution, and all these things come with eye tracking technology, because yeah, you have things like foveated rendering, where you render only a small fraction of the picture with a high resolution, and this kind of high resolution point changes based on your gaze behavior, because yeah, as the human eye has only a very small fraction where the information is obtained in a very high resolution level. And of course, there are some other developments happening in the background, like the PlayStation VR2 also comes with eye tracking technology. And many people think, so we shall see that this kind of eye tracking technology is not only used for technological reasons, but also things like making interactions a little bit easier. So for instance, when you want to grab something, you can simply look at it and make a gesture, and then you can pick it up. So in some cases, this might be a little bit tedious in VR when something is far away from you, and with this kind of gaze interaction could be achieved rather easily. And of course, the quite obvious thing like the metaverse. I'm actually not that sure how this thing will evolve, but in general, this kind of idea, which is not that new, opens up many different possibilities when it comes to gaze interaction. So we have different actors, different stakeholders who want to collaborate, want to communicate, and gaze could serve as a facilitator, or jump forward, as an artifact between different spaces, like a real space, augmented space, or virtual space. So we shall see how these things might involve in these kind of scenarios. There's already research going on, and I think there are many things that we can also do here in this field. And of course, another thing, the prototype that I showed you worked only for a few number of people. So I think it's quite challenging to have this kind of gaze-based support for players with huge audiences. So we have to think about quite different methods to achieve quite a similar effect when you have these kind of small groups and players and these kind of huge audiences. So this is also a thing that requires further investigation. And another thing which I think could be quite interesting in the future is gaze as guidance. This was a research project that we did quite recently. So this is a VR game prototype where you are a thief and you have to find several gaze coins, and you have some kind of a gaze guidance. So you look at certain areas and you get some cues that there is maybe something that is hidden, and then you can pick it up. So in this case, we're more interested in using gaze as or we focused more on the visualization of gaze, not so to say the when, so more the how this kind of gaze-based information could be displayed in order to grant a high degree of immersion and without distracting the players. And this could be also interesting for social gaze as well. Think of a virtual guide or a person who provides some hints, and you could do this with gaze quite easily. And you can also see the guided, so to say, where you can see, so if this person is looking at the right direction, this could be also a very interesting source for research as well. Okay, so I hope I wasn't too fast. I'm in time. So the message here was, I think that social gaze is still, although I did several years research in this field, I think there are many open questions that need to be answered, and we are heading towards exciting times. Okay, yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so we are having some time for questions now. So one is already from the audience, so please go ahead.
Just like people are less and less comfortable with the always-on approach, and more people are covering the webcams and stuff like that. How do you try to tackle this problem, or avoidance of camera?
Yeah, this is a huge issue that each of us, I think, has an experience with it. When it comes to games, several ethical questions emerge. So you could gather gaze data to derive certain information. And of course, when it comes from the interaction side, in some cases, you simply don't want to employ a certain channel. And I think this should be optional. So the thing that I want to propagate here, and I hope I didn't transport the wrong impression, I don't think that each and everything should be integrated with gaze. So it should be something that is optional and should make sense for the user, for the player. So I think it could be quite problematic when these things are mandatory, because with it you could, or there is lots of room for misusing this kind of stuff as well. So I'm aware of it, and I think that gaze is especially useful in situations where people are interested. So this kind of close relationship that people had. So one of the playtests, people mentioned that especially when they're playing with close friends, this kind of thing is interesting. So playing with strangers and having this kind of very intimate way of playing, it's not always desirable, I would say. I hope this answers your question, or?
Yeah, kind of. It was more like, so like it was a problem for your work that people are hesitant. So if there are some more intrinsic motivations to get people to actually use it, which ways are being explored so people are more comfortable with it, maybe? and also that they're not that invasive or don't feel that invasive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the very interesting thing about the fact that eye tracking technology is quite popular in VR is not that people simply want to have it, but it's mainly for technological reasons. So it saves a lot of computing power, and then you have this kind of thing integrated into it. And until now, I think there are not that many strategies to have this kind of more subtle way of convincing people that this would make much sense. So my strategy would be here, as I said before, to use gaze, especially in situations where you have these kind of intimate experiences with another. So I think this could be a starting point, just to show this could make sense over when you have a relationship over a huge distance or so, that this could be a way of being close to the other. So it's more like using gaze, not as an interaction tool, just to look at stuff and shoot it to pieces, but it's more as an element to maintain social relationships.
I had not a perfect case appliance in social interaction because I looked at good and he nodded to me and I have a question with the chat that he realized it without saying something.
Perfect.
Perfect means of transporting messages. So there's one question actually from the chat, which I would like to read out first. The question is, do these gaze tracking devices work on people who are cross-eyed or people who are glasses?
Yeah, with glasses in general, we didn't have that many problems in our tests. What I have to add is, it's quite some time ago, but the first eye trackers were, since most of the eye trackers were developed by Scandinavian people, they're very good at detecting people with rather blue eyes, or they had some issues with brown eyes. And yeah, in most situations, the results are quite good. Yeah, so you can work with them. There have some restrictions. So in some cases, we have this kind of problem when people wear certain glasses, it didn't work. But in general, it was quite surprising also to us that it's quite robust, especially in this kind of VR settings. So in desktop settings, it depends also on the surrounding itself. But when you have some kind of a VR device, you can control this quite, yeah, so you have a very good control over the situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I have actually two questions. One is about like more or less like mobile eye trackers in general. So it's not about in the domain of gaming, I would say, but if you, for instance, have like 3 screens next to each other, like this one here in front, and all have a different angle to yourself, how is it about with the accuracy of the positioning somehow of the eye tracker? Because as you remember back then, I was also trying out a little bit of things. And with the screen that is directly opposite of yourself, it was a perfect good quality of accuracy. But if there's another angle, if you're not directly moving your head in that direction, you have difficulties with accuracy. Did this improve over time?
Yes, things improved, I think, quite significantly, especially when it comes to head movement. So they integrate now face detection and this kind of thing. So also the position of the head is now tracked quite nicely. But yeah, so we also have this kind of problem. So as you mentioned, so when you have something that is not directly in front of you, but in a different angle, so these things do not work quite perfectly. So there's also some issues that you have. Also the things like calibrating stuff. So when you want to have a very good, or when you want to have a highly accurate eye tracker, you have to calibrate. In many situations, it's sufficient just to do it without eye tracking when the precision is not required. And generally, you have to, make the calibration, and also these kind of special situations that you mentioned. It's quite problematic. Also, there is another thing is the distance between you and the eye tracker. So in most cases, I think the recommendation is about 7. I think the maximum is 70 centimeters. But when you move further away, the tracking might get lost. And I also saw some specifically built eye trackers for TV headsets. They were huge. I think there was a reason why they remained at the prototyping stage. So, yeah.
And the second question would be about like the social gaze. So did you also take something like the cognitive load or something like that into account that you could calculate back with the people diameter, basically? So, like with the social interactivities, we're putting something together, for instance.
And this is a thing that we did actually in another study. So, but it's a good point. So in this social gaze situations, we didn't measure cognitive loads. We just focused on this kind of social presence and the game experience in general. But in a recent study that will be presented in some weeks or so, we did, or we are going to do a research project that deals with gaze-based guidance. So we measure the pupil dilation and also the gaze behavior in general to identify if someone is lost in a game situation. So, for instance, it's a good indicator for cognitive load, as you mentioned.
Okay, there's some further questions from the chat. The first is from Klaus. Thanks for the talk. Could you quickly repeat how gaze was used in the screen cheat game?
Okay. So the game itself, as I said before, is quite simple. So you have to screen cheat. Yeah, so you have to look at the other screen. And in this case, as in the Mills game, simply the gaze of the opponent was shown. It was this kind of white sphere that was shown simply to make people aware if they're screen cheated or not. So it's a very simple way of doing stuff. And the reason why we did it, so we want to replicate this kind of very simple form in another genre as well, so that they can be comparable. And yeah, that's basically it. So it's rendered on top of the game scenario. So it's not part of the game. It's rendered above the game.
Thank you. There's another question I would like to take from Jakob Heinkel. How does the quality in gaze tracking compare between a common webcam as gaze tracker and a highly specialized eye tracker? Because I guess the principle is pretty high for each tracker.
The what?
The price points.
Yeah, of course, there are some differences. So the eye trackers that we use, I have I think 90 hertz rate, and the trackers that I typically used for analysis have 220 or so. And there's a huge price difference, surprisingly, actually, because the technology itself is quite the same. So the eye trackers themselves that you could use for games, they cost about 200 euros or so, 100 to 200 euros. If you want a good webcam, I think it's also not that cheap. So, but when you use webcams as a gaze tracker, this is possible. I showed you the game just before your eyes. The quality cannot be compared. The eye tracker is much more precise, or even the rather cheap ones. Yeah, but in this case, before your eyes works perfectly fine because it's not required to look precisely at something. So they had this kind of huge collision boxes that you can look at. And
one follow-up question: do you know, by chance, how much AI is involved in these things?
That's a black box, actually. Yeah. So Toby is a company, and they earn money with it, and very interestingly, other companies. Most of the other companies were bought 5 years ago. So Toby is one of the last companies that does eye tracking. So I think SMI was quite popular in Germany. They bought, I think, by Facebook or so, and iTribe was bought by Apple. So all the big companies bought them up. So I think that's also a reason why I think that eye tracking will be still relevant in the future, especially when it comes to augmented reality. Or at least that's my estimation.
Maybe one thing from my side. So you said eye tracking is mainly composed of this virtual reality glasses because of augmented reality.
Yeah.
So it's not that much used actually for interaction.
Yeah.
Do you think this will rise very rapidly now in the next years, or what do you expect?
It's rather hard to estimate, but I think it's much more feasible now. So one of the main restrictions that game companies mentioned that, okay, we are not interested in this stuff, is because the hardware wasn't there. So the consumers didn't have the hardware, and when there's no hardware, it doesn't make much sense to develop something. So it will be more attractive. The question is, what will be actually done with it? So I'm not fully convinced that like this Asteroids game, I think it's quite nice for 1 minute or so, but this is not something that would have a lasting impact on the game industry in general. But I think there are some things that could be relevant, especially when you have a look at, this is the reason why we were so interested in social gaze. Maybe use this kind of gaze information to build into to this kind of human interactions that occur. But yeah, in some cases it might make things easier. So, but I don't think there will be tons of games out there that's explicitly focused on games. So yeah, it's like having a game that's mentions, okay, we now created a game for a gamepad. So it's just a means to an end. And but you can be rather creative with it. So it's not just something that's there. And so these are the standards. I think they can invite and provide lots of opportunities for experimentation.
Did you find a lot of similarities and how people like watch the screen or the gaze in general, the games? Are there like some kind of situations where there are a lot of similarities where you can derive information, or is there a lot of variance between each and every person?
Yeah, this is a thing that we didn't analyze because this is also some of the policies that the companies have. So when you use these kind of eye trackers that are cheap ones, you can use it for interaction, but it's prohibited to use it for analysis. And you have to buy the much like, more expensive one. And at that time, we didn't have these kind of trackers. And it was also not, so the questions that we had was, does it make sense for our research questions to also have this kind of stuff? But on the long run, I think it's quite interesting to have this kind of analysis part as well. Yeah.
Maybe one follow-up question. That's probably also very relevant for game development and analysis, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, we already did some stuff. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. That's really nice. My question is, you mentioned it, I think, during the board news that players started to use the eye tracking some in a way so they could mislead their opponents. So can I think of it like they started to focus on parts where they think that the opponent will then see that I will place my piece, but in reality I placed it on the other side.
Exactly, yeah. So this was one of the most used strategies. And we enabled also voice chat, and they use this kind also of chat. So okay, do you see where I'm looking? So and yeah, it became as I said, some kind of a meta play. So a play about play, and yeah, this was one of the most often used strategies. And the question here is, this is also some of the limitations that I have to add is the long-term effects. So it's quite nice for playing the game for 20 minutes. Questions would be then, does this kind of strategy still will be applied in later games where you have some degree of mastery and you're used to this kind of game. So this is also a thing that at least I think we are not the only one. I think this is a general problem with this kind of studies. And also the novelty effect of the gaze interaction in general. So people are fascinated, but yeah, things would look quite differently when it's something that is quite common to you. But although I'm using this device, it always surprises me to some degree. Yeah.
Maybe one final question, because you're talking about gaining by experience. Is it more exhaustive to work now with keyboards and the gaze when you play a game, or is it research in that direction? It's more demanding for the player.
It depends strongly on the integration itself. So in some of my students willfully created something that is very demanding and used gaze as well, and people hated it. But in this case, it was okay. It was a design choice. But yeah, I think in some situations, it really makes sense. For instance, in the Toby showcase where you have this kind of a person play a game, it really is sometimes tedious to pick up items. So you have to use your left analog stick, you have to move the camera and then press a button to pick something up. And with Gaze, you just look at it, press a button, that's it. So in this case, it makes much more sense. But yeah, in other cases, it looks like a bit strange. So people are a little bit also alienated by the integration. This is a thing that we are also did a small project with a colleague where we focused about the metaphors of gaze. So if gaze have a certain meaning or gaze are associated with certain human habits or communication processes. And many games, many gaze-based games neglect this kind of stuff. It is very strange. So there is no clear relation. Why do I need to, for instance, look at it to make it explode? In general, it doesn't make much sense. And I think these things are quite interesting. It's not more about the tool itself, it's more about the meaning. When there is some kind of, I don't know the English now. So it's, it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
All right, so if there are no further questions also from our virtual colleagues, I think we once more. So very nice talk and very nice presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.